As we honor Torrance's centennial, we're taking a closer look at the people, places, and things that have played a key role in making the city what it is today. As part of our centennial series, we're speaking with those who have held the honorable position of Torrance mayor. Ken Miller was elected to city council in 1962. After 2 council terms, he ran for mayor in 1970. He won that election and served as mayor until 1978. His name was well recognized in Torrance in the 70s and 80s when Ken Miller Realty signs peppered the lawns of Torrance neighborhoods. You may also recognize his name if you visited the Ken Miller Recreation Center located at the Torrance Civic Center. Today we meet the person behind the name. Hello, I'm Colleen Farrell, and thanks for tuning in. And former Mayor Ken Miller, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Now, you were born in 1922, and that was even before there was a Torrance hospital. Tell us about your birth here in Torrance.
That time, particularly that time, was when downtown Torrance was downtown Torrance. I mean, that was the hub of the entire commercial shopping center for the city, because at that time we only had 7 square miles of city. That's prior to annexation. And I was born in the El Prado apartments, which are on the corner of Satori and El Prado. And at that time, I remember the big merchant in Torrance was Sam Levy. And at that time, Sam was living in the next unit in the hotel. The reason we're in a hotel was my father was a steel worker in Pittsburgh, and they offered him a job out here when they opened us in the steel plant in Torrance. And so at that time, which is about 1917, 18, they moved out to Torrance and had to live in Los Angeles because they had no place to live in the city except the apartment houses. For a long time, they used to travel from downtown LA to Torrance on the old Pacific Electric car, traveling down Western and dropping off, which is now the Western Depot. That was the restaurant. That was a depot for the get off, go to work, come back at 4:30, get on, go back up. And then eventually they got into the hotel, Proud Hotel. That's where I was born. That was, as you said, was a year prior to the building of the Torrance Memorial. I have a younger brother who was 4 years younger than I, who was born in those hotels. So that was life as it was, as it was tonight.
And there was a doctor or a nurse present? Or
Dr. Lancaster came in, and he was the one of 2 doctors in Torrance, and everything was done in Torrance at that time was through Dr. Lancaster and Dr. Scheidler on it. And so that was sort of the coming of it. And I remember very well as I stayed in those units, so maybe 2 or 3 years, I can't remember when, used to go downtown on El Prado. It was a dirt street at the foot of the hotel and throw balls around, baseballs around and whatever, play there. Then we eventually were able to move into a home on Gramercy Avenue, which happens to be next door to Louis Zamperini, the great Olympic star.
So those doctors must have been pretty busy in town at that time.
Oh, yeah, and this, remember, back in roughly 29, was the Depression, you know. So maybe I was 7 or 8. I remember that the fact that practically no one had money. And I remember Dr. Lancaster coming to our house and taking care of my mother. And she gave me couple dollars to give to him when he went out the door, and he took the money and put it back in my coat and said, "Keep the money," you know.
Wow, things were different back then. So as you mentioned, your father came here from Pittsburgh, and Torrance really did originate very much as a blue-collar town with such companies as Columbia Steel and Union Tool and many others. How did that sort of impact the commercial development, also the residential development here, that it was so much of a blue-collar origination?
Well, there was the steel plant, and there was Union Tool, which made tools for oil wells, for oil tools. And you either worked at one place or another in Torrance at that time. And you're thinking about a population of maybe 1,000 people, give or take. And that was it. I clearly remember the oil workers and the steel workers would get off on Friday night and go down and have their pants pressed and cleaned or whatever, and go out on the town for when they got their paychecks on it. So it was just, that was the town. That was the heart of the town. And El Prado Street and Satori Street was the major. There was no such thing as, obviously, the Del Amo Mall and what have you. And so we would accommodate. However, we had so few stores that I remember my folks, when they really wanted to shop, would go to Long Beach, or they'd go to Inglewood, where the shops were, to shop. Even Lomita had more shops than Torrance had on it.
That was before the days of Del Amo Mall.
Yeah.
As I've been working on the Centennial series, I've heard a lot about the factory frolics. Did you participate in those? And tell us about that.
I'm fully aware of it. But they held them in old downtown Torrance on El Prado Street, and they had a cage there, and they would take some well-known person and jail them, as sort of as a joke, and they have to pay a fine to get out, That's funny. That's the only thing I remember of the affair.
Yeah, from what I understand, they used to have big dances in the old Civic Auditorium, and that was sort of like a hub place for everyone from the South Bay area came, and I think they were Friday nights, I believe.
The Civic Auditorium was located on the corner of Cravens and El Prado, which is now a health building. You can buy health equipment. That was Civic Auditorium, and of course the City Hall was directly where the Time Warner Cable is located now. That was City Hall at that time, and the fire station and police station was right next door, where is now a parking lot on it.
Now, your father, again, was from Pittsburgh. Did they go and actually recruit workers?
Yeah, what they did was, as I was told, they went to Pittsburgh, Youngstown, and Nova Scotia, or their big steel plants, and they said, we're opening a plant in Torrance, California. Of course, nobody knew where Torrance, California was. And we have a job out there if you want to go out to California. And my dad was one of the several that took and came out from Pittsburgh to Torrance, which was Neverland. And the only reason why they built a steel plant in Torrance, basically, was George Sidney Torrance was a developer from Pasadena, and he was looking for sites. And they thought that if they got out of the city of LA, the taxes would not be as high. So they come out to the middle of nowhere, literally, and built the plant there. And as the story goes, and this is what I've been told, I was too young to remember, but they built the plant so it backs up to Western Avenue. And originally they were going to build a canal from downtown LA to San Pedro in order to transport shipping. And of course the canal was never developed, but the strip of land between Normandy and Western the city of LA annexed that. So they have a tie-in with the port of San Pedro. Obviously the canal was never built, and therefore they took the plan as it is, and same thing with Union Tool. They backed up to Western Avenue, but those dreams went astray a long time ago. But that's how they got there.
Take us back and tell us what it was like, you know, being a little boy growing up in Torrance. What were the local hangouts, and what did, you know, kids do here when they were growing up back then? There wasn't the mall, there wasn't video games, you know, what was life like?
Well, it's a funny thing. At one time, I lived on Arlington Street, for anybody, Arlington, near Plaza del Amo. And next door to the house I lived, a little one-bedroom home, there was a vacant lot. And the kids would get out there and pick up football, you know, choose. As a matter of fact, the team from Andrio Street versus the team from Gramercy Street. And we used to play, and then when the fathers got off work, they would come down there to watch, and in the meantime, they took over the game. We got shoved aside, and they ended up playing in the game. I can remember that very clearly on it. But it's sports. It was sports. We would play to kick the can at night. Say, I lived on Gramercy, as I say, at one time. And at night, we'd choose up sides, and Andrio versus Gramercy, and we'd play, if you know what kick the can is, and play until midnight, literally.
And talking about how times have changed, I've also heard that kids used to hitchhike down to the beach and thought nothing of it.
That's a story in itself. We were all beach people in those days, the kids from the school, high school, and from literally elementary school. And I would stand on the corner of Crenshaw and Torrance Boulevard and wait to hitchhike to the beach. Well, it'd take about 20 minutes before a car would pass, you know, and then they would always pick you up because they knew you. And that's how we got back and forth on the beach.
Well, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, farming as a major industry in Torrance? Yes, that's right. We'll talk to former Mayor Miller about what rural Torrance looked like. Stay with us.
Behind the wheel, there is no such thing as a small distraction. A public service reminder from the American Academy of Orthopedic Surgeons. Speak out against distracted driving at decidetodrive.org.
Welcome back. In celebration of the city's centennial, we're getting a first-hand account from lifelong Torrance resident and former Mayor Ken Miller on some of the events that have shaped Torrance history. Torrance had a pretty diverse farming community. It ranged from pig farming to strawberries to dairy farms. Did it really seem like growing up in the country back then?
Yeah, I suppose it did. You got to remember, at those times, Torrance was a city of 7 square miles. So areas beyond, say, Hawthorne Boulevard going west, that was all farmland. And Japanese people would farm that, mostly Japanese. A few people like Bill Mertz, who made his living off that, was one of the few Caucasians that actually farmed that land. And the Japanese did a wonderful job in farming it. The ironic part of that is what is now well known as Walteria. From Walteria to Sepulveda, coming north, west of Hawthorne, in deep winters when the rain really flowed, that was completely flooded over. Mm-hmm. You used to row boats in that area, that whole area, which is now part of the city of Torrance, because at that time the 7 square miles was represented on the west side by Madrona and Sepulveda on the south side. So, and the area south of Sepulveda was the area that was really flooded. It seemed like every winter we had that going on. But the Japanese did a tremendous job in farming that land prior to World War II, of course. And not many, after many of them went to the camps, mm-hmm. so to speak, and very few came back after World War II. Mm-hmm. we still have a couple citizens from that era of time still in Torrance. So it was a big, then Torrance decided to annex. And they annexed from 7 square miles to 21 square miles, give or take. And that included the annexation from south of Sepulveda and from Madrona west to Hawthorne Boulevard, some in North Torrance and some in the Riviera, and we become roughly a 21 square mile city. And that was all vacant land now because there was no more farming going on. And that's when the developers came in, Ray Watt, Don Wilson, after World War II, and built so many of those tract homes that are there now. Southwood, for one, and that population just boomed then. And that was in the 50s and in the 60s. And as the population, as they built houses, the population kept increasing. So by, I would say, approximately mid-1960, the population was probably close to 50,000, just like that. We were the all-American city at one time. We were chosen as an all-American city. And the growth was just so overwhelming. And I think the people, the city did a great job in laying out the developed areas that were developed eventually on that. So once we got into the 21 square miles, it just changed everything.
Now, you mentioned earlier your relationship with Louis Zamperini, and I heard a story that he actually changed your diapers.
No, I'll tell you the story. Not quite Louis, but his mother did.
Okay.
I lived next door maybe from the ages, age 7 to age 14. So I was the class of 41 at Torrance High. Louis was the class of, I think, 35. So he was 5 or 6 years. And in those days, the elementary school was separate from the high school, but they had no middle school. So you went to the elementary school up to the 9th grade, then you moved on to the high school, which is you're really way down on the ladder in 9th grade and in a senior high school. But what happened with when I was mayor at one time, and I knew the Zamperinis really well. I was in and out of their house. They had Louis had a sister named Virginia who was my age level, and we used to walk to elementary school together back and forth, and I'm in and out of their house. I eat spaghetti in and out of their house. And what happened was that I was at the mayor of the city, and there was a problem in her neighborhood, which is just off the corner of Crenshaw, Sonoma, where she lived. And she was a wonderful lady. But I said something that she didn't like. And she got the microphone, and she said, "Now let me tell you something. I changed your diapers when you were 2 years old, so don't tell me what to do."
Don't get too big for your
I
britches.
shut up.
Yeah. And just so for those of you who, I assume that everyone knows who Louis Zamperini is, but he is our local Olympic hero and World War II hero as well.
I was fortunate enough, my daughter had always, who lives in Santa Rosa, had always wanted to meet him because she heard these stories from me. So one day I called Louis, and we went up to his home in Hollywood Hills, and we spent about 4 hours just chatting about Torrance as it was, and she got a real earful.
And another influential family is the Post family.
Yes.
And you were also close with them. Tell us about your relationship and the influence they played here in Torrance.
We grew up, George was about a year behind me in school, and we buddied around, and we loved the beach, playing volleyball.
First of all, who was George?
George Post's grandfather started the first bank in Torrance, Torrance National Bank on the corner of Satori and Marcelina. The grandfather started that bank, and there was only Bank of Italy was across the street, which has become the Bank of America. There were the two banks in town. The grandfather passed away, and George's father took the bank over as president and held the bank for many years. And subsequently, George was being tutored to really take the bank over. And when the directors decided to sell out the First California Bank, I believe it was, United California Bank, George went along as a manager in that branch for many years, and then resigned and started his own bank, which is Torrance National Bank on Sepulveda, which is now, and they, about 7 years ago, they sold his interest and George retired. Well, so happens he and I buddied around all those years, and his mother owned some lots out in South Torrance, and George built a house on it, and I bought the lot next door. So for 46 years, we were neighbors. And I loved what he said to me when they dedicated the Ken Miller Recreation Center to the, they had a group of a couple hundred people there, and everybody gets up and says nice things about you and all that. George got up and he said, you know, the only reason they're named this after Miller was they're going to tear it down next year anyway. And he sat down. He never said anything else. That was George, you know. And but we were probably as close as anybody could be for all those years. And of course, our wives got to be very, literally like sisters today, and we're still living next door to Phyllis. George passed away approximately 6 or 7 years ago. You have to know George to appreciate. I did his eulogy, and I said, one of the cute stories is his bank was just located across from the Madonna Marsh. So he decided that Torrance never had a ocean front, and you know it rains and the Madonna Marsh fills up. So he declared a new commission in Torrance called the Harbor Commission, and he became president. He had a badge running around town as president of the Harbor Commission. He would do things like that, you know.
Yeah.
But he just had a personality. If he said something nice about you, you probably wasn't his friend. He'd have to be saying something.
Look out.
With a twinkle in his eye.
Okay. I want to talk about the Depression and World War II and how that sort of impacted your family and also life here in Torrance.
Well, like many families in Torrance, virtually all of them, going through the Depression, that they were laid off work. And I remember they had a welfare program in Torrance where the mothers would go down to a little unit across the street from the old post office, which is now the Historical Society office building. And they would go in there and they would sew clothes up, and they would get food coupons. And then they would go, there was 3 stores in Torrance then, Piggly Wiggly, and a local one, and I can't remember the other one. And they would take the coupons and trade them in for food. And that's how one of the ways you ate. And handing clothes down to each other was just automatic. You know, from one neighbor, they outgrew them to make sure somebody younger would get those. So there was a complete organization. There was a wealthy side to Torrance in those days. I mean, people that weren't wealthy necessarily, but well off, that grew out of Post Avenue and all those nice homes and everything. The Post home was one of those that Mr. Post had built, obviously still there. And then they were well off enough that they would share with people of lesser means on it. So that was really nice. I didn't think much about it at the time. I was a little too young. I was like 9 years old on it, and we accepted it as a way of life.
Right. Now you graduated from Torrance High School. What sort of path did you take after you graduated?
What was that?
What was your path after graduating from Torrance High School?
Well, I went to Compton Junior College. I worked 1 year after getting out of the service. I was in the service about 3 years. And I went to work at Union Oil for 1 year, and I realized I was literally getting nowhere. And so I went back to school. I had the GI Bill, of course. That was one reason I went back. And I attended Compton JC for 2 years and then moved on to Occidental College, which is a highly accredited school, believe me, and a nice, beautiful school. And I graduated with a BA from them. And I have a teaching, I went to SC for a year to get my so-called secondary to be able to teach on a high school level. Finished that, and I knew I wasn't going to make much money doing that. Meantime, I got married about that time, and that brings back the Post family. I got married, Judy, that was 57 years ago, and we really didn't have any money, period. So I went into Torrance National Bank, where Wallace Post, George's father, was situated. And they didn't situate in offices. They were on the open floor. And he said, well, and you always treated me like George treated me, you know. Well, what do you want? I said, I want to borrow $300. Well, what do you want $300 for? And I said, I can get a used stove and a refrigerator because I just got married. And he said, you what? You can't even afford yourself. Anyway, I got the devil from him for a good 30 minutes. You're doing the dumb thing. Remember, I used to go up there and play in the house with George, and so he knew me very well. And finally, after about 30 minutes, I recognized I wasn't going to get any money. So I got up to go out the door. He said, where are you going? I said, I'm going across the street to see Mr. Sears, who's the bank manager of Bank of America, see if he'll loan me the money. And he told me, get my tail back here and sit down. So I got another 20 minutes, and then he told to his assistant, Bob Deininger, he said, give him $300, $350, and now get out of here. I said, well, what do I sign? Come back next week. Wow. I paid him back. And that's how, then I was able to work part-time at things. And then, but when I got out, I realized the teachers were not making much money, and I thought I'd get a real estate license and maybe work on the weekends, you know, open houses. And I fell in love with it. I just fell in love with it. But I remember so many times in the beginning, just got married, and I spent literally a couple of years just touch and go. I worked a tract of homes at one time out in the Garden Grove area, and I did make some money off that, and I put that money in the bank, and I allocated money every month from that, as long as that lasted, because I didn't sell a thing for 6 months on General House. Then I sold a couple. Well, meantime, I would say, I'm going back to teaching. At least it's consistent. I have a paycheck. And just about time I'd sell the house. Oh, I would never leave this business. This is the greatest. And I was touch and go for a couple of years until I established myself. And I ended up, you know, selling houses to my friends and I went to high school with, or folks, and it was a very local thing for me at that time until I kind of grew up literally and become more stabilized.
So that takes us to your eventual involvement in local government. I want to talk about that and how you got involved in local government and sort of the chain of events that led you to ultimately run for mayor.
It started in the 1960 when I was in real estate, you know, full bore by that time. And George Bradford, who was a councilman, who I had known all my life, called me one day and asked me, he wants to submit my name for the Planning Commission. And I really didn't know too much about it, to be honest with you. But I said, well, what's involved? He said, well, it's two nights a month, you know, plus, you know, doing your background work. And I said, okay. So he submitted it, and I was approved, and I'd become a planning commissioner for 2 years, from 1960 to 62. Previous to that, I got some name identification because I was president of the Torrance-Lomita Board of Realtors in 1959. And I guess that gave me a little exposure. And so I served 2 years on the Planning Commission and truly loved it. I really enjoyed it. But I get upset sometimes when we recommend things to the city council, and they would overturn us. We were only a recommending body, and so I decided to run for council, and I won. I was the most surprised guy in the world. I was one of three. There was 3 seats open, and I got the 3rd seat at that time. And but then I served 4 years as councilman, and on my brochures I insisted, because I believed wholeheartedly in 2-term limits, and that was prior to any time that 2-term limits was even mentioned. Nobody